Well, I make it 8 o'clock, so that means we're going to start this masterclass looking at your hotspots. And you're here because you are one of the first 20 participants who signed up for our Kickstart program. And you're extremely welcome. And it was lovely to have all of you on the Kickstart program. I don't know if you were some of the ones who were very engaged in the Facebook group, but regardless, here you are to sort out your hotspots. And some people have sent in their areas of interest, which is great, so we can get straight into that. And I'm mindful that there will be people listening the recording who cannot be here in person, but let me just say hello to those who are here in person, and feel free to join in at any time. I know people will join in the call as we go along as well. So I think what I'll do is I'll leave you unmuted so that you can join in whenever you like. Hello, Justine.
Hi.
Hi, welcome along. Thank you for sending in your issues of interest.
Thank you. Yeah.
What I'll do from time to time is I'm going to share my screen, and what I'll be showing you are things that are in the Academy, in fact, so, but you may not have had time yet to find your way around the Academy, but there's a bit that's sort of parenting insights and solutions and our top tips. So occasionally I'll share that on my screen. But otherwise, let's just get straight into it. You may know that I'm in Australia, so it's 7 o'clock in the morning here, and 8 o'clock in the evening for you. For those who are in the UK anyway, I'm not sure where everybody's joining from. So just to remind you that anything you say on this call about your families, I expect everybody to keep confidential. That's one of the parameters of being in the Academy, is that anything that's in the Facebook group there, people will keep to themselves. And so if you're on the call, I assume that you've agreed to that. Okay, so let's get started. We might start with looking at an area that affects every single family I've ever encountered. You know, if I had £1 for every time somebody says mornings or a hotspot for me, I could have retired by now. So let me just pull up on my screen the top tip sheet to do with mornings. Which one is it? Yes, there we go. So how can I make mornings calmer and more harmonious? So this will be in the Academy, so you don't need to worry about scribbling anything down. Let me get rid of that. And so basically, the reason I've started with mornings is because it is one of those hotspot areas where some of our skills, sorry, let me just make sure that everybody's in the meeting. Hello, Catherine. Hello, Edwina. And just to make sure that, can everybody hear?
Yes.
Okay, I've got one response. That was Justine, Catherine, and Edwina. I just want to make sure that everybody. Oh, good. Excellent. Good. Okay. I seem to have to admit people as they come along, but so if I get a bit distracted doing that, forgive me. Okay, what we were talking about is mornings, and the reason I've started with mornings is because it's a very common problem, but also because it's the area where everybody is trying to get some cooperation, and cooperation is an issue across the board. And it's also one of those areas where some of our parenting skills go out the window because we're stressed. I think, I mean, join in if that's not your experience of mornings. But what people normally say, of course, is that you've got a certain amount of time to get things done, And that's exactly when your kids decide they're not going to cooperate. And why are they not cooperating? Has anybody got any thoughts about that? Well, tell me about your experience of mornings rather than me just rattling on. Is this not an issue for anyone on the live call?
Well, hi, I'm Edwina. Can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Edwina.
Yeah. I apologise for joining late.
That's all right.
How our mornings? Well, we've allowed a lot more time to be able to to be able to spend more time with the children, rather than, I noticed that I used to come down with sort of 5 minutes to spare and scream at everybody that we're late, so we have to get out of the door and quick, put your shoes on and that kind of thing. And now we've worked out that we need to allow, a lot more time to be able to take things at a reasonable pace.
Yes, of course, time is our enemy in the morning. Yeah. And I love that Steve Biddulph always says rushing is the enemy of love.
Yes,
which I think is a very apt phrase. It could be the catch cry of the modern parent. We're always trying to do a lot. And Juliet, who's one of our facilitators, says that you've got to be a time realist, not a time optimist.
Yes.
And I think that means that we consistently underestimate how long it takes things to get done. And one of the things that we underestimate is how long it takes our kids to get things done. And we think, for goodness sake, how long does it take to do up your buttons on your shirt? But it's not necessarily that. You may have to accommodate some gazing out the window, or some sitting there thinking, or just the amount of time it takes some children just to wake up.
Exactly.
What you can see on the screen, I hope everybody can see this, it talks about being a time realist. That means a lot of preparation. And it's one of the keys to making parenting go well, is thinking about hot spots in advance and working out what's needed. And the great thing is that when people talk about hotspots, they say that my kids are always like this, and suggesting that there's never any relief from it. But in fact, if your kids are always behaving in the same way, that gives you some predictability, which means that you can prepare for it. So if you know that mornings are always tricky, then you can do some planning that will help with that. Does anyone think that, or have the experience that your mornings are tricky because of your child's temperament?
I'm Tara, sorry again.
Hi, Tara.
Hi.
That's all right.
So I have a 2.5-year-old and a 5-month-old.
Okay.
And I may duck out in a minute to eat some food because I'm starving. Yeah, I have a very strong-willed toddler who wants to do everything himself, including kettle, putting the toast in the toaster, has an absolute fit if I do anything when I'm impatient trying to carry things along. And obviously it gets worse and worse, but then just won't do things. He wants to take his sweet time doing it all, and then inevitably at some point the baby either.
Okay. Can I suggest that maybe it's I've unmuted everyone, and it may be a good idea if you mute yourself, if you've got stuff going on in the background, and then just unmute when you're going to speak. So toddlers, of course, that's the other thing. It's the stage of development that your child is in is very much going to affect how they respond to the various hotspots in our lives. And you've just described classic toddler behavior, Tara. They want to do everything themselves, and then they have their own time frame for it as well. And of course, no sense of urgency. Now, you may say that older children don't have that either, but certainly the world revolves around a toddler as far as they know. And that's just normal. It doesn't mean, it's not a character flaw. It's just how they are. And so that's comforting and not, because you deal with it. So it's comforting in the sense that it's absolutely normal, which I'm sure you know. But how do you deal with it? Well, actually, in the same way that you deal with things with an older child, is some preparation. But one of the things that makes mornings go much more smoothly, doesn't matter what age your child is acknowledging how it is for the child. And that's emotion coaching, which is module 2 in the academy. And what it means is just saying things like, you really want to do this yourself, or you really don't want to do this, whatever it is. And just the fact that you're acknowledging that doesn't mean you're saying, oh, well, then you don't have to, but it's just looking at it from your child's perspective. And Bonnie Harris, who's a writer we'll refer to often, she's the author of What to Do When Your Kids Push Your Buttons. She says, she talks about acknowledging your child's agenda, and that their agenda is just as important to them as ours is to us. So for us, we have to get them out of the house in the morning, get them to daycare or preschool or school. And we may have to get to work ourselves, or whatever else is in our day. And there's a time frame for it that, you know, and even if we do get up at 5 in the morning, it still feels like there isn't enough time for everything that we have to do. And there certainly isn't enough time for a child to be on a go slow.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course, Catherine, hello.
I was just wondering about, we've had a few instances recently, generally our mornings are really smooth, of food refusal. And so acknowledging you really don't want to eat the food that you've got, at the same time, just any other sort of ways of phrasing that, and practically sort of how to deal with that. As you say, you've always got the countdown clock going. I think for us, especially because mornings usually go very smoothly, I'm often quite wrong-footed, and as I have been the last couple of mornings when there's been complaints.
Yes. So mornings, you're talking about food at mornings?
Yes, so I don't want to eat the food that I've eaten every other morning for breakfast.
Yes, so much fun. Yeah, so you've been using some emotion coaching, it sounds like.
I attempt to.
Yeah. So the first thing to do is to give yourself permission to be human, and realize that you're not going to be at your best if you're tired and stressed. So in terms of the preparation, it's partly about getting enough sleep ourselves, and making sure that we are at maybe not optimum conditions. I'm not going to be unrealistic, but at least so that we can clutch hold of some of our parenting skills just when we really need it. So take care of ourselves is always in the background, because we can't use any of our skills if we're not. So having done that, then you're trying to acknowledge how it is for them in the moment. Now that's going to be true whether we're talking about meal times, whether we're talking about the other aspects of mornings, whether we're talking about screen times, which is another issue on the agenda for today. And so we need to always be seeing it from their perspective and acknowledging it. Now, I understood that you got that idea, Catherine, but you're looking for different words. And is that right, or am I, have I?
No, absolutely. It's sort of what when you can see things are starting to ramp up.
Yes.
And you're trying the emotion coaching, but sometimes when it comes to food, I'm trying to think of any other options at that point, but it's sort of, you know, there's a point A and a point B we need to get to, and I can recognize that we don't want to be on this road, but at the same time, point B is coming up, and you got to eat.
The two tools that really help you in crisis are both emotion coaching and descriptive praise. So it may not be the most instinctive thing to do to reach for your praise book, but if you can, it will certainly help change the mood. And since it isn't always the most instinctive thing to do, one of the things that I did when I first heard about descriptive praise and I was finding it difficult was to write down a whole lot of phrases that I could pop out in moments of crisis. And actually, I had them written down, and I was sort of thinking, I'll keep them in my pocket and pull them out in emergencies. And the first time I produced them, my son, Christian, who was 7 at the time, was fascinated by this. And he said, what have you done there? And I said, oh, well, when you were at school today, I sat down and I wrote down all these things I really like about you. And he said, really? And he was completely fascinated that I was A, thinking about him when he wasn't there, and B, that I had nice thoughts about him, because up until that time, that hadn't been particularly apparent, I think.
Oh, that's lovely. Oh,
and I did it later on, actually, when my younger son was about 13 as well and was struggling with homework. And I wrote down a whole lot of things that, when I wasn't faced with the crisis moment, were easy to come up with, but in the moment can be difficult. So I wouldn't have any hesitation about using a strategy like that.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, so the other thing about mornings is, so we have to be realistic about time. We have to do lots of preparation. You know, how much of it can we take out of the morning, so that, you know, how much can be done the night before. But also in the moment, lots of descriptive praise, lots of emotion coaching. If you don't know what those are yet, that's module 1 and module 2. They're always going to be the 2 skills that will help in any situation. Okay, so it seems natural to go on from mornings to looking at screens, and that often when we're dealing with screens with little children, it's not very problematic because we're in charge of the screens. But with older kids, not so much. So let me go share my screen with you. I'm just going to find the other one. There we go. I'll reduce that so you can see the whole thing properly. So this is, again, one of the top tips that we've got in the Academy. And it's, what you can see is that it's all about, I'm just going to use my mouse to highlight, it's all about communication and connection. And that's true whatever you're trying to get your child to do. Sorry,
so I can't see the screen.
Can't see the screen. Ah, that's
no, I can't see that.
See how to make mornings calmer, but I can't.
Can you see it now? No, that's the old one. Sorry.
The old.
Now, that ought to be on your screen, but... Okay, let me figure out how to do that. Bear with me. Maybe I'll just close that. You can't see the screen one yet? Okay.
I can still see the old one.
Okay, let me get rid of that and see.
I can only see the old one as well. Just
yeah, no, I think you're all looking at the same thing.
Oh, fine.
Let me stop sharing and then go back to... I assume you can't see that. Okay.
Oh.
There we go. How's that? No?
I can see that now.
Ah, at last.
How do I
work out
manage
technology? Sorry?
Yes, I can see that too.
Okay, great. Okay, so where we were is about Screens are a particularly problematic area for us right now because it's in the evolution of parenting, it's a relatively new problem, but it is a problem for most of us. As soon as our kids get to a reasonably independent age, certainly where they can turn on a screen by themselves. And I think for most people, it's about finding a balance so that they can, we recognize that screens are very useful tools and that kids need to become adept at using screens, actually. And they're always going to have them in their lives. So there's absolutely no point in us putting our head in the sand and saying, oh, I'll just ban all screens. But most people want to have a balance between screen time and other activities. And do sing out if that's not what you're concerned about. But otherwise, I'll sort of plow on. I think one of the things that really doesn't work is to be a Luddite about it and to not understand how the screens that your children are accessing work. So if it's social media that they're into, then you need to know how those different platforms work. If it's gaming, what they're into, and understand the content of what they're accessing. So just total bans or talking down the things that they're into will just put them offside, and that's not helpful. So what will work better is actually to get into it a bit and to try and understand what they love about it, to recognize that if it's video games particularly, that they're designed to be very compelling. So no wonder it's hard to turn it off. And that's often an issue for families, is how do I get them to turn it off? So it comes back to the same issue as mornings, is preparation, but also that the communication. You're never going to have any influence with your children if your style of communication with them is just to bark orders at them and to tell them off when they're not doing the right thing. And that, believe me, I know that that's what happens to lots of us, lots of the time. But so that's why it becomes so important that we're looking after ourselves so that we can be in a calm state. So let's assume that we've done that and we're in a Zen-like state. How do we prepare for having a happier experience around screens? Well, some families will, depending on the age of their children, and I'm talking particularly for 10 plus, that you might actually have a meeting to sit down. Well, you can have meetings at ages much younger than that, but if you sit down at a meeting and the object of that meeting is to come up with an agreement, a contract, if you like, which you might write down to, or even sign, to discuss how you as a family are going to manage screens. And most rules are a lot more effective if they're whole family rules. And whether that's to do with meal times or bedtimes or anything else in the family, because then obviously kids can see, well, it's not just me, I'm not being picked on here, but that everybody follows the rules. Now, of course, there are different applications for rules for adults than there are for children. But for example, one family rule would be that everybody gets a healthy amount of sleep. And what that is for a toddler is different from an adult. And in terms of screens, when you're devising the rules, you actually start with what your values are, and you have a discussion with your children about the values. And one of your values may be that we want to have balance in our lives. Yeah, screens are great. They're great entertainment and they're very useful tools, and that's not a problem, provided we've also got balance in our lives so that we're doing other stuff, we're doing physical activities, we're spending time outside, we're spending time with family, we're doing the things that we have to do, like homework and any chores. So that sort of concept of balance is introduced before you get into any of the nitty-gritty of rules. But then you talk to them about how those values would translate into the how, what, when, where aspects of the rules about screens. So let's assume that your rules are in place and you've got them written down, and you kind of feel like there's agreement about it, so therefore we're going to be fine from now on. And then lo and behold, what happens is that they get engrossed in something and they don't turn off when you've asked them to. So the question is, what do you do then? I would always start with intervening early enough so that you're still calm, because if you wait till your buttons are really being pushed, then you're going to have a problem. And so that means not giving second and third and fourth chances, actually, but going in straight away to say, what was our rule about this, and ask them. Don't just say, I told you to turn that off after 20 minutes and here it is 40 minutes later and it's still on. So we need to say something that empathizes with their problem, because they're not doing it. They're not turning off to be difficult. They're not trying to be defiant, but they are stuck in that place, which is very hard. And adults know this too, which is that this is riveting, this stuff. I love it. And for teenagers in particular with video games, that can be an area of their lives that they are really comfortable, really happy, and actually feel in control and happy and successful. And it's possible that they don't feel that a lot in other areas of their lives. You know, for some kids who are sort of getting on okay at school perhaps, but they don't feel that they shine there maybe. But when they get on their game and they can get up to the next level, and they're a master in that world. But even if it's not quite like that, it's still very compelling and very hard to turn off. And we know ourselves because we're kind of attached to our phones and our iPads and things as well. So if we can empathize with them and say, I know how hard it is to turn off. I go onto social media for a minute and I find half an hour's gone by. And be realistic and admit how difficult it is for you, and so acknowledge how difficult it is for them. But the empathizing doesn't mean that you're going to say, oh, well, then you can have another half hour. If you've agreed a certain amount of time and that time is up, then it needs to go off. So I don't know if time is the only issue here, or whether is that what those of you who are concerned about screens, is time the biggest issue? Is it limiting the amount of time?
So the screen time thing was a big issue for me. I've got 3 boys, 15, 13 and 11.
Yeah.
And actually I find what you're saying about, you know, social success or social validation. So he doesn't do anything like social media, but you know, playing online, you know, the Fortnite especially, which is a one-player. They are choosing it over going to somebody's house, because actually if you're at somebody's house, it's a one-player game, they prefer to be in their own homes and socializing over the PS4. And you know, I mean, maybe it's because it's just not how I grew up, but it's you know, it's very unhealthy. You know, the subject matter is not particularly enlightening or, you know, uplifting. And actually, you know, I'm just constantly sanctions, you know, so they keep on going, Mom, I'm going to finish my game, but these games go on forever.
Yes.
So, you know, you get at it, you know, I'm just going to finish my game. And it's like 40 minutes later, I'm kind of, Zach, you need to get off this. Yeah. And then again, he comes off and he's depressed. And then he's sort of, you know, when can I go on again? When can I go on again? And it's absolutely right. They're designed to be addictive. And I say, Zach, you know, this is, you know, my issue is that this thing is being prioritized over, you know, inviting people back, you know, going out and playing basketball. And he's a very, very sporty guy. He's starting to miss, you know, after school activities and be able to go home before I'm home so that he can actually go online. And I just found it was too much. So I did ban it, take it away. And actually we have now come back full circle and we are doing a contract. And actually that's, because I basically said, you know, you're not getting it back until, you know, we can decide how we're going to use it. They've really been asking me, okay, so what is it that is upsetting you about why, you know, why,
that's good. How?
And so he actually sat down and he wrote, I mean, he's, you know, he's pretty lethargic. So the fact that he is so motivated to do this shows how, you know, important it is to him. So I think, you know, this idea of, you know, sharing values, you know, and putting some time frames around it and this whole balance, you know, he said, well, now he's going to do a bit of running, he's going to do a bit of revision, and then maybe he can have a time. And I've kind of said to him, look, I want to be sort of like, so we're trying to come up with a, you know, an hours per week. And he's sort of saying, well, maybe 20 hours. I'm just like,
so you're going to meet somewhere in the middle, probably.
Exactly. But, you know, I just...
And you can also build in things like if we see your grades falling off or you're neglecting your sport or things that you used to be interested in, then maybe we need to readjust this.
Yes.
But I think that sounds like a really good approach. And I can tell you that the opposite approach so doesn't work. And one of our licensees actually was telling us about with her son, she used to just rubbish what he was into. And I would say, you know, you were saying that Fortnite's not very highbrow stuff. And she was saying similar things about whatever was his current flavor of the week. And he just felt that she was disapproving of him. And that's obviously not what she intended. But he's actually gone on now. He's just finished school and he's doing computer science at university. And he's making a career out of it, or that's his plan. So, you know, she and so even if it's not your whole focus, kids will be using it far more than we ever did or do currently, probably.
But I think it's also, you know, they come off their Fortnite and then, you know, they go onto their phones and they're then sort of checking the score. They go onto a computer and they start watching YouTube of Fortnite, and I'm just like, guys. So I'm trying to have this idea, the device time or screen time involved, you know, is including all these other things. It's not just like, well, you do, you know, 1.5 hours on one and then you sort of and I just feel that the kids these days just can't be bored. They are you know, they if they're entertained or they're not having something which is very riveting, they actually just say, I'm bored. Like, great.
Yes. And my children got very tired of me saying that I was pleased when they said they were bored. Because that was the moment when their brains would start to work.
Exactly. And I think, you know, what I was struggling with was, you know, what is the right balance? So I think some of, you know, his friends don't have any limits.
I'm afraid that probably is true. And so that we have to accept that is true when they tell us that. And then we just have to say, well, I can't be responsible for the values in another family. I mean, you're not going to denigrate them because those are his friends. But you say, in our family, we believe in a balance. And if you're saying that, then you've really got to model it. Because they're not going to take on values that you say you have if you're then on a device a lot of the time as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think it's not just, you know, it's, you know, so I think what's happening now is, you know, you could be, or, you know, my husband says, well, actually, I'm reading the paper. And I just say, well, that's not what they see. They see you looking at a screen. In a way, you know, going back and actually picking up a book or picking up a newspaper sends a different signal, because they're saying, oh, dad's reading the paper, rather than, oh, he's on his, you know, computer. You know, this, you know, they're much more, and actually now what they want to do is they want to watch TV and be on a computer.
I know. See everybody with their individual screens in front of a big screen. Yeah. So it will take some thought. If you're going to have whole family rules, then you know, you really need to think, well, what do we really believe in here? And manage your screen time. I love that we now have technological things that can help us manage our screen time. Like on iPhone, certainly have an app that helps you monitor and be aware of how much you're using your phone and the different applications on it.
Yeah, I have put on all those controls, and I think actually it's really good to do that, no matter what age your child is, to actually just
or even for yourself, maybe.
Yeah, well, and as well, exactly.
So technological constraints will help, but we cannot rely on them, because at the age your boys are, certainly they'll figure out ways around them pretty quickly. So we really have to rely more on the human controls, and that's teaching them the values around it and finding the balance in their own lives. Now, clearly, when your kids are 11, 13 and 15, they don't have fully mature brains yet. So their impulse control is not as strong as it hopefully will be when their brains are fully mature. So we have to be their impulse control for them to some extent. And Catherine, your toddlers are in exactly the same state, their brains also.
I didn't have this, sorry.
Oh, so, apologies. Who was it who was saying the toddler? Is that you, Tara?
It's me.
Ah, yes.
Toddler and baby.
Yes, exactly. So there's a great similarity between a toddler brain and a teenage brain as they're going through reconfigurations.
I was going to ask a quick question though.
Yes.
Just on the, I think I'm thinking about consequences. So if we have had an issue in some way, we have in the past been saying things like, okay, that's no screen time tomorrow or whatever it is. But then there was another part of the parenting practice where it was talking about consequences being related to the activity. And obviously, you know, having a complaint about leaving the house or something is not, or, you know, a meltdown in the middle of the street is not something that's anything to do with the screen time, but it's so effective because I think Justin was saying that they're so motivated by the screen time. So that's a bit I'm trying to balance out, is if it's so effective, should it be used, or is it because it's not very connected to because they're generally not badly behaved when they're on screens?
I think it's difficult to use screens as a reward or a consequence, because except to do with screen usage, because if we do, we're prioritizing screens, and that's actually what we're trying not to do. So do you know what I mean? So if you say, if you behave well, you can have an extra half hour on the iPad, that's really...
That's a bad spiral. I've made that mistake before.
But that's positioning the iPad as this great thing. And they already think it's great. So we don't need to prioritize it like that. But in the same way, I wouldn't use it as a consequence to take away screens for poor behavior. The only way I would use screens in that reward consequence way is for screen behavior. So if you're following the rules about our screens, then you earn time on the screen. And so if you turn it off when I ask you to, then of course you can have the agreed amount of screen time next time. And likewise, if you haven't turned off when you were supposed to, then you haven't earned it for the next time. And there's a world of difference between saying you haven't earned it rather than I'm taking it away. Because of course the latter puts you in the position of being the horrible, mean parent. You're such an ogre. You take away my God-given rights of screen time, as opposed to putting the responsibility with them. which is where it should be. So that's true generally for using consequences, is have them earn their privileges. And that's pretty much everything other than food and a roof over your head, so that they take responsibility for it. Okay, so one of the other things that was on the topics that people had raised beforehand is general non-compliance. And I think, Catherine, it was you who mentioned meltdowns when leaving the house. And I think that that's an area where we're stressed anyway, because we're trying to get out of the house on time. So it's hard to retain our cool. But definitely the things that you mentioned and that we've talked about here in terms of bribery and punishments don't work. And we find ourselves getting into a difficult spiral, as you mentioned. But one thing to raise there is temperament. And in the Academy, in the top tips, the parenting solutions section, you'll find a page on temperament. And I'll keep talking, but I'll see if I can share the screen to pull that up. There we go. Can you see that? No? Okay, sharing the screen seems to be the issue. There we go. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great.
Yes.
So this is, let me just scroll down. No, it's not going to let me do that. There we go. So this goes into different aspects of temperament. But one thing I particularly wanted to mention was adaptability. In terms of getting out of the house, certainly it's going to be relevant, but for lots of other things as well, is that if you've got a child with a temperament that isn't so adaptable, they're going to have a hard time with transitioning from one place to another, from one activity to another, even from one person to another. So that child is going to have more difficulty stopping what they're doing and getting off a screen, coming for a meal, getting dressed when they're doing something else, and certainly leaving the house. And so while that's their sort of genetic predisposition and their way of relating to the world, biology is not destiny. And we can definitely influence them and change behaviors around that. But we won't do it by making them wrong for it. So I learned this the hard way. My youngest son was a glass half empty sort of person, and I worried about that because I thought he was going to have a miserable time and that people wouldn't like him and that it wouldn't serve him well. But it was how he was. So when I learned to accept him for who he was and help him to develop a more positive outlook, then that worked a whole lot better. So if you've got a child who's not particularly adaptable, then one of the things that you can do is to not make them wrong. Say that you're a person who likes to know what's happening. You like to stop and assess before you'll commit yourself to something. You like to be organized and prepared. Those are all good qualities. We can highlight those things as being a great way to be. And there's always two ways of looking at the different aspects of temperament. So we can sort of highlight the good things about it, and we can allow time for transitions, and we can help them to be a bit more flexible by noticing small signs of when they are flexible and descriptively praising that. And we can help them prepare for things. So with things like getting out of the house, clearly a few minutes warning would help, but I'm sure we all do that kind of thing when we're in a good space ourselves. We have to remember that they need it. And I think the thing here is to keep on not being frustrated by it. It's who they are, and definitely not blaming them for being that way. So if we can say, I know this is what my child needs. Sometimes Elaine refers to orchid children and dandelion children. And if you've got a dandelion child, they will flourish in any conditions. And you don't need to water them, they'll just grow. But if you've got an orchid child, you need to give a lot of care to nurture them. But then when you provide the optimum conditions for them, they will be the most beautiful, they will have the most beautiful blooms. And, you know, they need greenhouse conditions, but boy, do they look great when they flower. So we need to sort of think, what does this individual child need in order to flourish? And it may be just that they need more time. My youngest son was like that. He needed to know what was going on. And at the age of 13, I thought, for goodness sake, haven't you outgrown this? And no, he hadn't. So on one occasion, I can remember going to pick him up from school to take him to an appointment. And normally he got to and from school by himself on his bike. But because we were going to this appointment, he just expected me to pick him up in the car. And actually his school was near a train station, and it suited us because we were going into central London to go on the train. But I hadn't told him that's what we were going to do. Now, he didn't have a meltdown about it, but he was grumpy. And he was just being a bit difficult. And I realized that he just needed a few moments to adjust to that. So that's can be helpful if you just tell those sorts of kids that this is what's going to happen. And if you're not like that yourself, that may be difficult because you're not sort of thinking in that way. Okay. One of the other issues that came up beforehand was not about temperament, but about what you might call gendered behavior, which is girls can sometimes have very cutting words. Girls are very adept with words, and they're very sensitive to words as well. So they're very vulnerable to parents' words, but they can also use words themselves to get you exactly where it will hurt, particularly when they're in their teenage years, but long before that as well for some kids. And we need to train our kids to coach them around words and using them carefully. And I suppose we're talking about kindness and consideration and sensitivity to others. They will get that from what we're modeling. I always think about modeling. Modeling is 80% of parenting. And that's a blessing and a pressure for us, because there's a lot of what we just do that is the kind of behavior that we want our children to do anyway. So we don't have to think about it particularly. But there's also things we're modeling that they didn't pick up on perhaps. But the other 20% is important too. So I'm absolutely certain I was eating my broccoli when my children were young, and that did not mean that they automatically were eating their vegetables as well. So there's another element. You know, we do have to have rules. We do have to actively be teaching them the ways that we want them to behave. And in the case of put downs and unkindness, one of the things that we need to do is to look at why that's happening. So my two boys used to fight a lot when they were kids, and the way that the older boy would behave was that he would put his brother down a lot. Practically every time he walked past, he would just say, loser, you know, and he'd say, you stink, you weirdo, you're stupid, you know, all unkind words. And I dread to think what he would have done if he'd had the greater vocabulary that his female equivalent might have had. but anyway, he was pretty sharp with his words, and it took us a long time to work out that Christian was doing that because of the state of his own self-esteem, which wasn't strong. He felt bad about himself, which is why he was unkind to his brother. Now, he didn't just use words. He was sometimes physical with his brother as well. But when we started to address the self-esteem issues, then we found that that's when we started to see real differences. And I'm going to share one other piece, which is about siblings, since we're talking about this. Or maybe I'm not. Actually,
how did you realize that self-esteem?
How did I realize it? Just by looking at the behavior. Actually, I could figure out that behavior doesn't come out of nowhere. And a lot of his behavior seemed to indicate that he was suffering. And he, because of the put downs, that was a real indicator. But when he'd get in trouble, which he did a lot, both at school and at home, one of the things that he would do is he might make excuses or lie about his behavior or sort of withdraw into himself, which was telling me, once I started looking and got a bit more skilled at thinking about these things, that he couldn't take on responsibility. It was too much for him because he kept feeling, I'm such a bad person. So he was trying to push away behavior which reinforced the idea that he was a bad person. So we needed him to think that he was a good person who had made a mistake and that he could take responsibility for those mistakes. Those are ideas that we look at a lot in Module 5 when we're looking at positive discipline. But they're also part of Module 7, which looks particularly at siblings. Mm-hmm. But so if you, can you see the screen, the 7 steps to harmony? Okay, great. So the one at the top is give positive attention with descriptive praise. So that's really focusing on descriptive praise on the individual child so that they feel good about themselves, that their self-esteem is in a good space. So that when kids feel good about themselves, it's much less likely that they will take things out on their siblings. And there's another one, the other green circle here, which is noticing positive interactions. So that's interactions between siblings. So these are some of the things that we can do to improve on sibling harmony. And with going back to our girl with the cutting words, if we're building a positive relationship between us and our daughters, I mean, obviously this applies to our sons as well, but we're talking about girls being particularly skillful with words, then that's less likely to happen. But also if we're trying to teach consideration and kindness, then, I mean, unkindness is less likely when they're feeling good about themselves. So that's a really key part of the piece. But we can teach kindness as well. And that's modeling, using emotion coaching is empathizing with our children. When we model that empathy, they learn it as well. They're far more likely to become considerate and kind and empathetic if that's what we're doing. But we can also take further steps to teach it. And emotion coaching is all about recognizing their feelings and naming it. So we do that whenever they have a feeling, but also in the background, we can train them in habits of empathy empathy, which sounds like such a funny thing to say, but we're not just born either with empathy or without it. It is a learnable skill. And one of the ways that we can teach it is through literature. So if we're reading books, children's books particularly, almost always have good emotional content. There's always things, interactions between human beings. And so we can use that to talk about feelings. We can use video as well, so that will help. But if you're looking at a book and you're saying, you might pause reading and ask, what is this character feeling? And how do you know that's what they're feeling? And so you look at facial expressions and body language and the things they're saying. And given that they're feeling like that, what are they likely to do next? You can think about that. Or have you ever felt that way talking to your child? And it gets going a whole discussion about feelings, which forms the basis for developing some emotional literacy. That brings me on to one of the other topics that was raised, which was encouraging boys to talk. So I said girls are good with words, boys aren't always. So recognizing that that's a difference between them can be a good starting point. And if your sons are in the grunting phase, post-puberty, then obviously there's a whole lot less words. But emotion coaching helps with words. If the area that you're concerned about is that you want your boys to share with you, you want them to talk to you and particularly to share problems with you, then you have to think about why they're not doing that. One is maybe because they're a boy, but it may also be that they're worried about your reaction. So sometimes boys won't share problems with you because they're worried about what you're going to do. So are you going to storm into school or talk to the parents of their friends? Say, for example, that the issue that's coming up is something that's going on at school and your son has reluctantly told you about it, or you've learnt about it from somewhere else, and they're worried that you're going to go storming into school and make a scene, or they're worried that you're going to ring up the parents of their friends and either make a scene or suggest that they should all be banned from Fortnite because it's making them behave badly, or whatever. Then they'd be it would be understandable that they wouldn't be keen to provoke that reaction. But also, if they're telling us something that they've done and our reaction is to shout at them and be critical or judgmental and blaming, then it's not surprising that they don't tell us about that. So we need to, if we're going to encourage our boys to talk to us, we have to be very mindful of how we're listening. And we need to be listening. So if we think, yeah, I mean, obviously I want him to talk to me and I'm there to listen, but actually we've got our phones handy and we're trying to make a meal and, our attention isn't fully on them, then that may be a drawback. Maybe not. I mean, screens, yes, would get in the way. But for boys in particular, sometimes if they've got something heavy to talk to you about, then they may not want eyeball to eyeball communication. They may prefer it if that you don't have eye contact, that you're doing what Steve Biddulph again calls sideways talk, which is to do an activity alongside them. And I always found with my boys that the best communication happened when we went for a walk, because there's something about moving that promotes communication, and so that really got them talking. And by talking, it may be it may be grunts, but certainly when I was using emotion coaching with my boys, I didn't necessarily, well, they're different from each other, but particularly the older one in his teenage years, if I was empathizing about something, I was putting into words what I thought he was feeling. He wouldn't say, "Oh, Mum, thank God you understand me. Oh, such a relief to be understood." You know, teenage boys don't do that. But what I did see was change in body language, and his shoulders would come down from around his ears and his fists would unclench. And the next interaction I saw with his brother was much nicer than the previous one. So there's obviously two sides to the communication. It's how they're listening and whether they're talking. And when we're using emotion coaching and we're being a receptive listener, then they're much more likely to talk to us. And when I say a receptive listener, we're listening with a view to learning. So it's not that we're listening, waiting for our turn to speak and then to deliver the pearls of wisdom that we have to impart. So it's much more about getting to know you and your issue and understand what's going on for you. So that's what real listening is. And that's, I know we've talked about emotion coaching a lot in this call, so just to remind you, that's module 2. And I think since we're coming to the end of our hour, I'd really encourage you to get into the Academy and make use of the material, but also get into the Facebook group to pose questions there, especially if there's anything that's still outstanding here. Or just quickly, do you feel like you've got some answers? I'm going to unmute everybody. Do we probably only just touched on some of the issues, but I hope it was useful.
Thank you.
Yeah,
great.
Very useful.
Okay, great. So I will see you in the Academy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for taking part in the call. It makes it much easier when we've got some live participants as well as people listening to the recording.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.